Okay, welcome everyone. This is the book launch of Michael Saward's Democratic Design, organized by the PDD Specialist Group. So that's the Participatory and Deliberative Democracy Specialist Group of the Political Studies Association. My name is Hans Asenbaum. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance at the University of Canberra. And we're, I think, all really excited to discuss this book with you, to launch this book, so to speak. It's really, novel, cut of the edge, out of the box thinking. I think it's a really, milestone contribution to the debates we're all leading in democratic theory, thinking about or explore new ways of thinking how democracy, how democratic systems, democratic innovations, democratic institutions can be designed. So just a little bit about the format. This book, Michael is going to present the book in conversation with Becca Bunce and el-Wakil. And Alice and Becca and I had a bit of fun designing this book launch itself. So we thought, since the book is on design, we also reflect maybe a bit more on how we're going to go about this and design the book launch itself. So it's going to be a bit of an interactive conversation, and then obviously the last half hour is reserved for your comments, questions, and an open audience debate, which we're also very much looking forward to. So obviously, Becca, Alice, and I agreed that we want to take this occasion to primarily celebrate this book and celebrate this achievement as, a major contribution to democratic theory. But the celebratory tone that we're taking obviously doesn't prevent us from also asking critical and probing questions, which we think is also very much in the spirit of the book itself. So I'm going to introduce the three speakers, and then we're going to head into this conversation. So we're very happy to have Michael Saward with us. Michael is a professor of politics and international relations at the University of Warwick. He has written a number of books that made major contributions to democratic theory, has formed the field with books such as The Terms of Democracy, Democracy, the Representative Claim, and Making Representations. He has received several prizes and fellowships. Among them, he received the George H. Hallett Prize of the American Political Science Association for the book The Representative Claim. And for his current work on democratic design, he was supported by a major research fellowship from the Leverhulme Trust. So we're very excited to have you here, Michael. Welcome.
Thank you, Hans. Great to be with you and good to see everybody.
Okay, so next I'd like to introduce Becca Bunce. She is a PhD student at King's College London and at the University of Arts London. She holds a public policy and design thinking PhD studentship. She's looking at how people with lived experiences of inequalities may design or redesign democratic innovations. So they're really timely, the question of inclusion in designing democratic innovations. And very importantly also, Becca is a human rights practitioner working in civil society organizations, and she serves as a trustee of the John Ellerman Foundation. Welcome, Becca. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you. Great to be here.
And last but obviously not least, Alice el-Wakil. Alice is a postdoctoral researcher in political theory, and particularly in democratic theory at the University of Zurich. Her current work focuses on referendums, on institutions, more generally political institutions, but referendums particularly, and how these institutions can foster or maybe undermine democratic systems. Also interestingly and importantly, Alice is co-founder and former president of DemocracyNet, which is a research network on democracy, which is particularly impact-oriented and which also designs its own democratic innovations, among them the Abstimmbar. Welcome, Alice. Great you're here.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation.
All right. So we thought, before Michael gets to introduce his book very briefly, we thought we'd kick things off with personal reflections from Alice and Becca, because they read the book carefully, spent a lot of time also discussing the book with me. And so I wanted to ask you, Alice, first maybe about a personal reflection. What is maybe a key idea in the book that was important to you that also connects to your personal work and maybe helps you in your personal work?
Thank you, Hans. So this is the book. I should show it because we haven't shown it yet. I just wanted to say a few words about what accessible, but also the word that came to my mind when reading the book was that it was also a kind of powerful book, as we not always have a chance to read. It is powerful in its critique to existing approaches to thinking about democracy. It denounces a mode of silo thinking that has characterized works in democratic theory, that has been expressed in recent literature, among others by Mark Warren, but it also goes beyond by expanding this critique to other approaches to democracy, also empirical approaches to it. And it denounces this silo thinking for having limited our capacity to think in productive ways about how to enact democracy or about how democracy can be enacted. And this is something I was, of course, found extremely appealing in the book, because it's something I came across when starting my research on referendums, which were usually put in a box, and it was impossible to remove our blinders and look at what it was that these specific processes were doing. It's also a powerful book in the sense that it proposes a valuable alternative approach with a comprehensive and extremely detailed toolkit for democratic design. It offers a proposal that reinforces the push for us to think and design democratic systems, not only innovative institutions within those systems. And it makes clear that we should do that because systems and the procedures and the practices that constitute them are the place where democracy becomes a thing. It's the place where ideals, where principles, where equality or freedom becomes enacted. And it's also an approach that starts with what is there in specific contexts with, as I was saying before, as few blinders as possible, to think imaginatively and creatively about what democracy might be in different contexts and about what potential there is for Democrats, for democracy to think about what could be in a kind of abductive reasoning that Michael Saward puts forward and promotes in the book. Now, as it's generally the case with Michael Saward's books and research, it questions what many of us have been taking for granted. More specifically, questions that it makes sense to talk of democracy as a kind of design, or did it make sense to talk of democratic or institutional design? And by making this concept strange again, it also goes the extra mile of bringing democracy scholarship, broadly understood, in productive dialogue with design scholarship to give substance to this assumption and enrich thinking about designing and redesigning democracy. It's also a book that raises many challenges for democracy scholars, generally understood, I think. It asks that we preserve an active and critical stance as researchers, that we ask not only about what should be, but also that we reflect about the assumptions that we make, whether they correspond to politics as it is done in specific contexts, and how political ideas, but also existing practices, can better help us to think of solutions to current problems. And it's really a push from what he calls first order models or theories that prescribe particular visions and structures of democracy towards second order work that asks, what can democracy be in this context driven by these concerns? A sentence of the book proposes a particular challenge for democratic theorists that I will try to reflect more in the coming times. But also a challenge, I think, for democracy scholars in general to imagine and engage in new ways of doing research. This sentence is the following on page 26 of the book. Democratic theory's continuing relevance and usefulness depends on its puncturing the boundary between it and comparative and institutional perspectives. Democratic theory needs to become something it has rarely been in order to do the work expected of it. Now, at this stage, I feel like I'm still processing the book. It's a very dense and very insightful book. I'm also still processing the implications it has for the ways I've been doing research and for the ways I will be doing research. I know I will need to let it sink in, but I'm very confident that it will stick with me and stay next to me for quite some time. And with this, I hand over to Becca.
Thank you, Alice.
Becca, go ahead.
Alice has so beautifully summed up the book, but I think from my perspective of coming into this, I came to the book with both enthusiasm and frankly relief that someone was bringing together these two fields of both design and democracy. As I applied for the PhD, one of the things that was in my proposal was the fact that when I looked in the indexes of books, you couldn't find the word design in it when you were looking at books that were talking about democratic design. And to not define a term seemed quite strange, really, when we think about how as academics we do love a good definition. And I think there's something about that reflection that I also had noticed that in my own work as a practitioner in human rights, that as people are designing interventions in democracy, it's almost seen as quite a neutral position. It's almost designed out the concept of design. So I enjoyed the fact that there was a centrality here of putting design back in, the intentionality of design. I also particularly enjoyed the calls for action in the book as an invitation to take a step back into second order modelling, and particularly the framework that Michael provides, moving on from these more rigid models of the democratic and democracy into this more abductive position of possibility, what we might be able to create. And so as Michael says on page 197 about the democratic design framework, it provides grounds for questioning would-be designs or designers, and for demonstrating what is missing in a given assertion, plan, or idea. The need for critical thinking is evident daily. And I think so often we can move into spaces, and whether this is about participation, democratic innovations, or any form of democracy, practitioners can move in these spaces without being critical of the frameworks that we're working in, and without asking, why are we here? Where are we trying to go? And is this the best plan that we can use? I think the other bit of this, which perhaps was particularly surprising, was how joyful it was to read. I think when we look at democratic theory right now, there is a lot of space for doom and gloom. We can see the threats and we're experiencing significant challenges. And what this opened up, it created a playfulness and optimism about how we can reimagine models of democracy, how we can borrow from each other, create hybrids, or even have radical design changes to democracy. And in creating an openness and a flexibility in how we can move forward, it might prevent us from getting stuck on we're not doing it right now. It allows us to move forward without a perfectionism that can sometimes be halting. In defining problems, it allows for complex and uncertain and changing contexts, and it allows that to sit. And it recognises that our responses and solutions will not be perfect, as I said before. And I think that that gives us a really good basis to move forward when we think about democratic theory, that we can get so caught up in arguing with each other that looking across to another discipline, to other spaces for challenge, can open up our ways of thinking about futures and engaging with democracy as a concept again, without it limiting us to such a narrow, siloed vision. And at that point, and it's in the spirit of criticality, we're going to be carrying on the conversation today, so playing with some of the ideas and exploring critiques. But first, I'm going to hand over to Michael to explain a bit more about the book.
Yeah, Michael, if you just want to try to give us an idea of the book in a nutshell. I know that's a difficult thing to ask. Maybe you could just in a couple of minutes stress the core ideas and point out what you think is most important before you head into the conversation.
I'll have a go at it. Thank you very much, Alice and Becca. There's already a lot of food for thought there, and I look forward to your questions in a moment, your further questions. So the main thing the book offers is what I call the democratic design framework. So Alice and Becca have both referred to this. And this is a quite specific kind of 10-point framework. I try to detail it as much as I can. So I'm not going to go through all 10 points. You'll be pleased to know about that right now, but I will say something briefly about what that framework is about. So I think if you're a citizen, if you're a, I don't know, a democracy think tanker, if you're a politician or whoever who is worried about the state of democracy, maybe in the country or in your locality, what are you to do? And there are a lot of people, Becca mentions the doom and gloom. There's a lot of people who are very concerned about democracy from all sorts of angles today, of course. We hear about the democratic disconnect. We hear about democratic deficits. We hear about democratic backsliding. That seems to be the current preferred phrase, and so on. So to repair or to deepen or to reinforce democratic institutions and practices, nationally, locally, or wherever, where do you start? Where do you start? So one option is to think about coming up with a plan for something better, to see it as an issue of designing, or probably more accurately, redesigning. So this democratic design framework is a set of guides and a set of tools for this kind of thinking and this kind of work. How to come up with a plan for change or reform. I try to make the framework in the book systematic. I've made it detailed. There's plenty of detail in the book, maybe too much. And I hope that it's practical. We'll see, won't we? I hope it's practical as well as a contribution to my home disciplinary base, which is theories of democracy. So as I mentioned, the design framework at the heart of the book has 10 main points. I won't go into them all, but I think in general terms, it offers guidance about defining the time, the place, the scope, and the context of desired changes or designs. So this framework focuses our attention on designing for context. There's a huge amount about context in the book and designing for context. The framework asks us to be specific about our democratic aspirations and values, not just assuming, for example, that some combination of rights, equality, and freedom, however understood, can automatically be taken as the values of democracy. Being open-minded, being flexible, and getting into detail about what we think democracy is, should be, or can be is important. So the framework includes a large menu of specific institutions and practices. This can be the stuff or the materials of democratic designs, from parliamentary bodies to town councils to different versions of citizens' assemblies, participatory budgeting, different sorts of referendums, and so on. So there are tools for thinking, crucially for thinking about how to arrange or how to order these elements and what the different alternatives are, and how ordering or sequencing them in a certain way affects behavior of politicians, citizens, and other groups. So if, for example, you have a referendum on a policy after a parliamentary vote, what does that sequencing in a certain context do to the behavior of politicians, lobby groups, ordinary citizens, and voters? What sort of incentive effects and other motivational effects are set up by a certain sequencing or ordering of democratic practices? So the framework also encourages its potential users to think about how a new plan for democracy would work in practice and over time, and to be really clear on what values we think should drive the work of democratic design. So if the question is something like, how can democracy in this place at this time be more engaging, more effective, more inclusive? The framework hopefully presents to democracy's potential designers the kind of minimum democratic requirements you can't get away with not taking on board. But on top of that, how best to kind of draw together different institutions and devices into a potentially novel democratic procedure. So the framework is a tool born out of democratic theory, for sure, but intended to be practical, to be useful across different political contexts. There's an important question here, which has been part of conversations I've had kind of building up to and working on the book, which is who designs? Who gets to design these new ideas and procedures? To cut a long story from the book short, in principle, anyone, singly or in combination, anyone. As I say in the book, with the term or the phrase democratic design, You can put the emphasis on the democratic, or you can put it on the design. And there are certainly more and less democratic ways to do democratic design work. So the framework and the whole argument of the book is built on the idea that democracy can be, will be, many different things in many different places. There is, I hope, that kind of open-mindedness and flexibility to it. Democracy is not one size fits all, and it is always unfinished business. It has highly diverse forms and practices, more so, I think, than we normally suppose. Both incremental and radical change are on the table. So we need to be really open-minded about what democracy can be, and indeed where it can be. The book also aims to describe, I would say, a move from theory to active theorizing, from models of democracy to active modeling. And the book's focus is on what, as Alice and Becca have both suggested, using the term abductive reasoning, focused on what democracy can be, what it might be, and not on fixed ideas about what it is or fixed ideas about what it should be. So to finish up, democracy, I say in the book, is, well, we can say it's all sorts of things, but one thing it certainly is, to my mind, is a design challenge. And in the book's final chapter, I try, I'm not sure if I succeed, but I try to rise to my own challenge. I offer one extended example of applying the framework in some detail. I call it a sketch because there's only so much detail you can go into. But I sketch a new plan for British democracy, featuring, for example, major changes to increase citizen participation and equality in the UK. And that's probably the best I can do by way of a brief summary, Hans. So I will leave it there and happily hand back to you and colleagues.
Fantastic, thank you. That was, I know it was challenging to address any of the deep thoughts in the book in this short time. So Becca, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, so first of all, congratulations on the publication. Given the importance of context and thinking about designing the book, I wanted to go a step back and think about your process of designing the book. And you highlight the need for interdisciplinary interrogation of design and to avoid silo thinking in the study of democracy. And I'm intrigued to hear about your design journey with this. What prompted your move into design thinking as a discipline? What was your experience with working with these different frames? And did it change what you imagined you would publish when you set out on this journey?
Thanks for that question. I think it's a really good question. Full disclosure, Becca and Alice and Hans kind of foreshadowed this question with me yesterday. The rest of the questions, I don't know what's coming, but this one I had a kind of foreshadowing of. I really like the meta question. So design of design framework, or maybe it's sort of 3 different levels. I've got a couple of different responses, I think. One of them is it takes me a very long time to do things. It took me a very long time to get to writing this specific book. So I've been in this game for a long time. If I go back to 1998, I published a book called The Terms of Democracy with Polity Press. Now, that was decades ago. And the journey between that book and this one is a kind of design thinking journey. I needed to unpack the fairly derivative and unoriginal, I'm still quite proud of it in some ways, but I think derivative and somewhat unoriginal analysis in that book, the book from the late 90s, and try to find a voice and an angle. And that really meant getting specific, like design thinkers say, look at the context, examine the context. You're not designing something in the abstract. You're not trying to come up with a product or an idea or a system in the abstract. It's to fit a context and to respond and resonate with a context. And you really do need to get down to details and specifics. So there was a kind of a journey from the abstraction and then moving more into, well, what is an institution? What is a practice? What does it look like in France? What does it look like in Britain? What difference does it make? And that meant in part taking a kind of design perspective, I think, trying to break disciplinary boundaries. there's a hell of a lot of democratic theory going on in the comparative and empirical study of politics. And theorists so often just use really simple stylized examples of the real world, which I think sort of undermine the theorizing in many ways. So these boundaries need to be broken down. And design thinking, I think, there are different versions of design thinking, but it encourages that. Can I give a shallow second sort of response, Becca? I think there is a structure to the book. There's a kind of symmetry. There is something pleasant about certain designs that bring symmetry. It's got 6 chapters. So the first 2 say there's some stuff missing. The second 2 say, okay, how can we fill those gaps? And the last 2 chapters, the third bit says, does this work? Does this work? Can we put this into practice? And there was an element of that symmetry which just sort of came to me on a dog walk when I was wondering what this book would be like, as sometimes things do. But if I can do just one final comment on that, if I can, there are messages from design thinking. I keep talking as if that's kind of one area where everybody agrees. They obviously don't. Design thinking is a kind of whole series of debates of different sorts. But there is a stress among designers often of getting rid of conventional approaches, or at least setting them aside, bracketing them, recognizing that design is redesign. You don't start with a blank sheet. Context I've already stressed, particularity I've already stressed. And this one was quite important, I think, for political theorists. You know, take a deep breath. There is no such thing as the final or perfect design. You might not get it wrong, you might not get it right, you might just get it different from others for all sorts of particular reasons. So that probably adds up to kind of half an answer, but I was certainly influenced in the framing of the frame by design thinking. Maybe one other thing, I didn't choose the cover of this, but one design decision I did make was not to allow a cover, as political theory books often do, of a bunch of old dead white men, you know, signing constitutional documents or something. Sorry, long answer.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question that wasn't prepared, but I'm just very curious when we think of designing. So you say design can be a noun of the plan that is produced through design, and design can be the verb of producing this plan. Which one is it in the book title, Democratic Design?
Good question. It's the verb. I think of it. Now, of course, the thing about design things like a book, like a, I don't know, an egg timer, anything, you pass it into the world and people will make of it and see it and think of it as they wish. I think of the title as the verb, as the practice or the action of designing. But as you point out, Alice, there are different points in the book where I point out the nounness and the verbness, and there was no way of getting around this. I just had to say somewhere in the book, look, you know, a design can be a thing or it can be a practice. It's both. In order to avoid confusion, you know, here's the noun, here's the verb bit, and let's spell it out, just so we try to be clear. I was influenced, well, by all sorts of people in writing this, but one of them was a book called a book about design by a philosopher, Glenn Parsons. I think it's a very interesting book. And he defines a design, the noun, in terms of a plan for a new sort of thing. I might not have the words, or I'm more or less quoting him there. And so as a noun, it's a plan. As a verb, it's a practice, and I try to emphasize the practice more.
Thank you, that's very helpful. I was trying to translate the title into German and French and wasn't sure which way to go. And yeah, this is very helpful. Now, I would have another question that dives a little bit deeper into the democratic design framework that you propose. And here I want to give some context to, especially to the audience who hasn't had access to the book yet. So a core component of the democratic design framework is the democratic minimum, which is composed of 6 necessary conditions or requirements developed in chapter 3 of the book. And it plays really an essential role in the framework in that it serves to identify which systems count as democratic or not, because these 6 requirements are a necessary basis for democracy to be developed above this minimum afterwards, so to be democratized in addition. These 6 conditions are also a core motivator for people engaged in designing democracy, in democratic designs. It's something that these democratic designers should agree to or want to value in their sense of democratic sensibility, as you call it. And it's also very important, these 6 conditions, because related to the purely democratic proceduralist view defended in the book, a system whose procedures meet these 6 minimal requirements ensure that the outcomes of the procedures can, in principle, be considered democratically legitimate. Now, I just want to briefly mention what are these 6 circumstances or requirements. The first one is community. So there is a group of people who need some process for reaching group decisions. The second one is governance. There is a process of governance through which group decisions are made and implemented. So it's not an anarchical system. There are operative, formal, to a significant extent, and persistent processes of governance over time. The third circumstantial requirement is equality. And here I just want to cite you on page 56, so the determination of governance forms and functions by the group's members regarded and treated as equals, which is a foundational part of the democratic minimum, including notions of equality of opportunity in the rules of governance. The fourth one is freedom, protections for freedom of expression and freedom of association, particularly, which are implemented strongly and consistently. The fifth one is resources. There should be access to at least a baseline level of material and service resources to enable the achievement of a minimally acceptable quality of life for all the members of the community. And finally, constitution. All the previous requirements are facilitated and protected from democratic votes or other actions by constitutions whose amendment is subject to special hurdles. And these constitutions ensure that the democratic minimum is persistent and can be predictable, or that the rules can be predictable by the members to some extent, and also make clear that the democracy is self-limiting. So it's not that the judiciary power is something else than democracy, it is included in democracy. Now, when it comes to designing democracy, designers should prioritize reaching this democratic minimum. It should be the first aim in case these are not met in a specific context. And then above this minimum, democracy can take a variety of forms, as you mentioned before, and implement further principles, which are called ordering principles, that range from accountability to participation, sustainability, radical equality, and so on and so forth. I think you have a nice list of about 40 ordering principles that could be implemented. And so this raises 2 questions that I want to ask. The first one, and we were all asking ourselves this with Hans and Becca, was, well, where do these 6 democratic requirements come from? Is there some kind of third level theorizing happening that makes it possible to put forward these 6 requirements? Or is it some kind of uncontroversial core on which all democratic theories would be able to agree, as for instance, Mark Warren has suggested in his 2017 article, and I think as you were suggesting in your 2003 article on enacting democracy? Or is it some other source that comes from for these 6 democratic requirements? And I guess the question is, well, what makes them sufficient and at the same time not too demanding for a minimum for democracy? The second question is about the further ordering principles, because it seems that the list of ordering principles is quite open. So there are the ones I mentioned before. There are also representation, recognition, rights, inclusion, virtue. And I was wondering if there are any limits to these kinds of ordering principles. Can any ordering principle be added to the list? There seems to be 2 limits. One is about the relevance that certain principles might have in certain contexts. And the other is that these ordering principles should not conflict with the democratic minimum, which needs to be guaranteed. But I was wondering, are there other reasons maybe to exclude certain ordering principles? Just to take a dumb example maybe, but would ethnic homogeneity as a principle to define the community be acceptable in the democratic design framework? Would it be a possible part of the radical pluralism for which you advocate? And relatedly, is the expectation that any implementation of any of these principles will amount to deepening democracy, as long at least as they do not undermine the democratic minimum?
Good questions. That was a bit of thinking time. Really good questions. So there are these, and thank you for kind of setting them out so clearly. There is a conception of the democratic minimum, and it consists of the 6 points that Alice sets out. So your first question, Alice, where do these come from? I'll start with negatives. They don't come from what I think we would all agree on if we really thought about it. There isn't a kind of John Rawlsian overlay here that we would all sort of agree on something if we thought about it in sort of the appropriate way in the right conditions. I make no such claim. I also make no such claim that there is anything much in this book about the so-called justification of democracy. This is how the philosophers tend to traditionally put it. Is democracy a good thing, and if so, why? I am not interested very much in that debate. I don't kind of go near it. I know it, I've written about it in the past. There's a version of a response to it in a book I wrote, I mentioned earlier, over 20 years ago. I find that debate extraordinarily sophisticated and moderately pointless. It seems to come down to a division between people who think democracy has instrumental value, or what's the opposite, intrinsic value. Well, it has both, and you know, why divide it up that way? So in a way, Alice, I do not provide any particular foundation. I do not provide any particular abstract philosophical argument for that set of democratic minimum. I think I say somewhere, slightly clumsily probably in the book, that I'm not so much interested in philosophical depth, but I'm interested in complex surfaces. I would rather kind of stay on the surface and explore the complexity of institutions, ideas of equality in constitutions, and so on. So I kind of say to you, and I say to my other readers, if you don't like this set of, I think, relatively uncontroversial kind of elements in the democratic minimum, then, you know, I've been a pretty open-minded and flexible author here, as design thinking demands, amongst other things that I be. So change it, change it. Here is an angle on this. And so it's kind of it's an unsatisfactory response in a way, but that is an honest response. There are certain things I did not want to do. Now, as to whether democracy is valuable and would produce these things, I have a kind of some substitute views, I think. So often, this is kind of a sidetrack, so I won't go far down it, but so often it seems to me that normative political philosophy, normative democratic theory, which is all about kind of ethics first approaches, is not so much advocating a certain value or position as describing it. It's describing it. And I'm describing stuff as well. I'm probably just being a little more open about the fact that that's the limit of what I see myself doing. So that's probably not an answer to your first question, but I'll move on to your second one. The ordering principles. That's right. So I make a distinction when required. If there's a principle, like a certain approach to equality, like you said, Alice, and to freedom, and if these are required principles of democracy, then you cannot avoid them if you're going to do work alone or with others as a democratic designer. And I think you said how many sort of potential, 40 plus, was it? There is a list there. Sorry, folks, there's too much detail in some of this, in some parts of this book. Is there a limit to what you could include amongst the ordering principles, which is what I call those which are more optional? What else do you think on top of the minimum, on top of the core principles? democracy should have. My favorite example there in some ways is ecological sustainability. There are old debates about so-called green democracy. Well, if you're trying to kind of fix green outcomes and overlay them on a democratic procedure, how do you do that? How do you kind of square that circle? So interesting sort of dilemmas are thrown up. Your question is a very good one about ethnic homogeneity. I think that it would probably clash with elements of equality in the democratic minimum, where a society is currently not ethnically homogeneous. So I think there would be tensions there. For a society which is, I'm trying to think what ethnically homogeneous means. That's an interesting question. But if the society that could be described as that, whatever that means, that might be another issue. There's a second kind of response I have to that question, though, which is, and I'm sympathetic to one of my intellectual heroes here, Robert Dahl, famous and very highly respected democratic theorist over many decades, no longer with us. When he said, sometimes democratic citizens and democratic systems make mistakes. Sometimes they need to learn from mistakes. I don't mean to say, for example, by saying that we should be really relaxed about certain things that are happening in Hungary, for example, or in Poland. I don't mean that. But only in the end, democratic citizens and protesters and opposition parties, only by action on the ground in the place by local people can movements away from democracy of whatever particular sort be kind of addressed or caught or effectively opposed. So I'm uncomfortable giving that answer, but it is one that I think we need to take seriously. Theorists and philosophers cannot solve the problems of the world. People have to do it in the end.
Thank you. Almost jumping off from that, I'm as well going to go for a question that wasn't quite planned here. Partly prompted by that, I was going to look at the role of the designer, because you've talked a lot about who designs, and your definition is quite expansive. It's very much in that participatory design, Manzini's ideas about everyone designs. And then there's the reality right now that we have, that bringing in some doom and gloom, unfortunately, some real concerns about this idea of a democratic backslide, or what is there to, who is influencing and designing democracy. So I noticed that the term designer wasn't in your index. And I wondered where you would situate the agent in the context of doing, in the context of the design. So how do they need to situate themselves in the context? What is their role? How are they held accountable? Because it seems that you're suggesting that it's going to be social movements that are going to be holding designers accountable, but is the democratic framework then a tool for social movements and holding designers to account for what is created? And how do we stop an almost godlike complex of the designer? Because whilst the design is, once it's put into the world, it's changed by how people interact with it. We also know that people have different levels of power. So, for example, one of the things you talk about is resources and a minimum level of resource that people need to be able to engage with democracy. And if we think about people in welfare systems in the UK and the rising use of things like food banks, it's very hard to engage with democratic ideals and ideas and the design of something new when you're hungry. So what is it that we do? Who realistically is a designer in this space? And what are the constraints, and how do we think about this use of resources in enabling designers? Sorry, that's a lot of questions.
That's really good. It's a lot of questions, then I get to pick and choose. Really good questions, actually, and they do all link to each other. I couldn't write about design and open-mindedness and stress flexibility and context if I did not allow for processes of actual democratic design being fairly capacious, that category being fairly open-ended. And I think I do a simple kind of three-part distinction at one point. You could have a kind of, you know, single, I don't think I say godlike, but I know what you mean, sort of godlike designer, kind of starchitect style democratic designer, or something extraordinarily slightly more elongated and participative at the other end. Most things are hybrids. If we look at examples, there are examples from, you know, British Columbia that books have been written about design of electoral systems. There are examples from Iceland about certain types of citizens' assemblies and designing. There are examples from Ireland, which are probably more hybrids. You know, not everybody gets to participate. It's structured in a quite particular way, but nevertheless, it's not starchitect, single sort of godlike person determining the design. Most specific examples of democratic design, and it happens a lot in the world, are collective up to a point. They are participative up to a point. Some really interesting examples that I thought about going into the book, but you don't want to make these things too long, is what I think of as kind of commissioning democracy. There's quite a bit of this happening now, a bit of a trend. So offhand, I cannot remember the European Union's, they have a new kind of framework to revisit, somebody will be able to jump in and remind me what it's called, but they have a new framework just established for attempting to think through in a fairly basic and systematic way the kind of where democracy is practiced and how imperfectly and what could be done about it across the European Union. There is a democracy commission happening with a couple of pilot projects at local level in the UK. In my native country, Australia, there's a lot of high-profile chat. I hope they get somewhere, and I'm keeping a close eye on it, for a so-called democratic voice, capital D, capital V, for an Australian Indigenous people in relation to their constitutional status and a way of being present in the representative process, much more effectively than has happened at any point in the past in the representative process at state and federal level. So there is this kind of a bit of a hit and miss round the world trend of sort of consciously revisiting democracy. It's often pushed from the bottom up. Sometimes it's government saying, yes, okay, we've been talking about this so long, let's actually have a commission and sit down and have participants. So that's a kind of interesting model to pursue, which is kind of a hybrid model, I think. But you are absolutely right. Thank you for pointing it out, and I am ashamed that the word design does not have its own entry in the index. Is that true? Is that really true? I just can't try to look it up quickly. It comes in under democracy, probably, or under democratic. But yes, shameful admission by the author of the book, especially since I think I criticize other people for doing exactly the same thing. Shocking. But
just particularly the word designer. Design's very heavily in there.
Oh, okay, designer, yes. So it's talked about, but it's not in the index. I take your point. I think, okay, final bit of response there. I was uncomfortable in some ways, but had to do it because you've got to focus somewhere. I focused on what I call governing institutionalized practices. It's a fair, relatively high level. Even if we're talking about sort of local government and local participation around the local town, it's still at a relatively kind of formal, relatively institutionalized political level. However, I do say at various points, this framework could be put into practice at almost any level. And if I think, for example, of just local town meetings where anybody can come along, or village meetings, which are open to participants and kind of semi-organized, and questions about who sets up the timing of those, who decides where and how they will happen, what is access to the building like? Can everybody kind of get in and out of that building who would want to be there? Is there an openness to different patterns of voice and speaking and presentation of self? These things are incredibly important. They are about resources and power. They are rarely about equal and inclusive uses of resources and power. And they are things that essentially my book does not touch for pragmatic reasons, but I'm glad that you point them out, because I hope the framework might be of some use, even in its partial rejection, possibly, for work at the personal and experienced levels of power, access, inclusion, which are fairly described, even at the most local and seemingly mundane levels, as examples of democratic practice, hopefully.
Okay, thank you, Michael, Becca, and Alice. I know Becca and Alice have more questions, and you might still ask them in the open discussion, but I think it might be time to open the discussion to everyone now. I'm sure there are lots of interesting points and questions from the audience. I've already seen some in the chat. So if you have a question, you can always raise your hand digitally. I'm sure you're familiar with this. If not, you go to the participant list at the bottom of the screen, and then you'll see an option to raise your hand. So I saw a question by Oliver. Oliver, did you want to ask your question yourself rather than me reading it out?
Sure, yeah, that gives me a chance to congratulate Michael as well. Yeah, I mean, I haven't read the book in full, but it's here and it's in the library, and my students are really excited. And I want to go to the point you make about resources. And I just wonder if what you are adding there is a flag so that the field begins to take political economy more seriously, right? Can we have a participatory democracy without participatory society? Can we have a participatory society without participatory economy? So yeah, I don't know. Are you hinting in that direction? And also, if I might take the chance, I wonder what you make of unconscious design, which in many ways is what's behind our current democratic systems, right? I don't know if you engage with that, but the unconscious designs that have emerged from historical development, and is what you're proposing here is a new tide of conscious design to undo and unmake some of the unwanted, undesirable consequences of unconscious design. Thank you.
Thank you. Hans, what do you want to do here? Do you want to, I can do this any way you like, try and do a quick response as we go along?
Yeah, you can just answer directly. There are no other hands up so far, so unless we have a queue, you can just respond directly.
Yeah, thanks, Oliver. Good to see you. Am I hinting at a kind of political economy dimension that is often left out by democratic theorists? Yes, I think I'm hinting. I probably don't do much more effective than hinting, although the inclusion of resources in the group of 6 things that I claim make up the democratic minimum does enter into a kind of debate that's been around for a long time and remains open. That is, what's essential to democracy and what is kind of important and interesting but secondary, not a kind of core component of it. And most people agree that freedom of speech and freedom of association and equal votes of equal value and a full universal suffrage. You can see where I'm going. So there's uncontroversial stuff, a lot of which is about individual rights, but it kind of goes beyond that, and political rights. When we get into, and you might say civil rights, when of course, and I'm thinking in kind of Marshallian terms about rights, if we go then into more social rights, if we go into cultural or even environmental rights, we seem to enter a gray zone where this is not the sort of thing that we constitutionalize in a democracy. This is not part of democracy's self-limiting or self-binding framework. This is a bit more controversial. It's a bit more, you might even say, ideological. If you're on the left or on the right, you probably have a different position. Or if you're green, you probably have a different position on these things. So yes, it's a hint and a nudge, maybe into political economy, but certainly into taking socioeconomic equality, resources in that respect, seriously as an underpinning for the value of things like freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of access to information upon which to, as a basis to exercise your right to vote, for example. And in the case study in chapter 6, the kind of UK-based case study, I do talk quite a bit about, the work of the Social Equality Commission and other bodies who've described deepening divides, especially in the era of austerity in the UK over recent years, and the impact on political rights capacity and participation that has, and it's quite direct. So I think my answer to you, and thank you for the question, it kind of we have a conversation about something important because you ask it. My answer is certainly a partial yes, which is not fully kind of spelt out in the book, but is a clear move in that direction. Yeah.
Okay, Danica, do you want to go next?
Yes, thank you very much. So I have one disclaimer, one question, and one comment. So the disclaimer is I actually haven't read the book yet, so Amazon sort of doesn't go where I currently live. So I'm waiting for it. But in reading your previous works and also in working on my book over the past years, I was like, drawing from your distinction, particularly between first and second order theorizing and your approach to democratic design, was deeply impressed by that. So now, when you were outlining your book and your own approach, I was wondering, and that's like the first question, how do you, in writing the book, conceptualize your own role as a democratic theorist? What is your stance on that, also vis-a-vis society? So what's your role as a theorist and what's your role as a democratic theorist? And the comment, maybe it's a comment, maybe it's a question, would be, so the question came up from your side, and I think also from Becca's side, what are actually like the material preconditions for engaging in democratic design also on behalf of the people. And briefly put, well, maybe you cannot design democratic institutions when you're just starving. One thing that I've been thinking and working on in the past months in exchanges with East African philosophers and anthropologists, and what I was deeply impressed by was that this question may actually depend on what we think democracy is about in the end. Is it about designing institutions? And what is actually supposed to be created or co-created or designed? And in these exchanges, so in exchanges with East African philosophers and anthropologists, I had actually learned that they work on democratizing measures for food security, mobilizing, for example, the knowledge of indigenous women in East Africa as a, and consider that as a political and as a genuinely democratic project as well. So that's not about institutions in any formal sense. That may not be what we often think about first when we think about democracy, but that can also be important in terms of creating the preconditions for democratic institutions in a democratic way. So that's sort of a comment and sort of a question, and I would be curious how you think about that from the context of your book. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think probably there's a good series of questions there. And kind of thought-provoking. Very partial responses. One would be the more kind of navel-gazing one, is that I've not been involved, across my pretty long career now, enough in actual work of democratic design. I've had some involvement with some think tank and other groups, and I've sat in front of House of Lords select committees a couple of times thinking about constitutions and referendums and related things. And there are some links, but not enough. The answer there is not enough. It's sometimes easy as a political theorist and academic to kind of downgrade what you may have to offer, but when sometimes you go along and you can see that there are sort of certain basic assumptions and things that we think about a lot in academia that would be really useful kind of on the ground. Should do more, can do better, as they used to say in school reports. The idea of commissions and conventions to draw people together to think about what the hell we think democracy is or could be here, and it could be just a really local context that we are talking about, I think is an underrated kind of model and approach. So if part of this is about how do people with all different kind of levels of capacity and resources and opportunities in so many countries, let's put it this way, there are not that many democracies around the world. Some of the countries that the well-known indexes like Freedom House and all that kind of stuff call democracies are pretty minimal democracies. Maybe, I mean, Alice might have a view on this, maybe Switzerland scores top of the poll, but then we worry about veils and minarets and such things. So democracies in varied degrees of kind of trouble all over the place, maybe. But that kind of model. As for people who are starving, don't have time to think about democracy, or they have few resources. I suppose one response to that, it's a kind of too general one, but the conditions that people are suffering really, really kind of basic issues about food and shelter and security. And especially if we're referring to kind of women and children and so many different circumstances across the world, and we can kind of all think of the places that I'm thinking of. Any kind of capacity, however imperfect, for democratic voice, any kind of capacity for inclusion will draw attention to the invisible. The invisible is often that people are starving, that people have no rights, that people are under localized, seemingly fully accepted and unchallengeable dictatorial kind of situations, even if we're not talking about kind of national level institutional dictators. Chicken or egg, democracy or resources? No, well, it's democracy and resources, or maybe resources because democracy. And depending on how we unpack those terms. I work a lot on theories of representation, as well as Hans kind of mentioned at the outset. And often representation is defined as making present. Are you present? Well, what the hell does that mean? That's an evocative term. Are you present? Is your voice heard? Are you seen? Are you apparent in a place where deep inequalities and lack of resources are kind of an attendant problem? Some people are not present. They are invisible. They are kind of Jacques Rancière's part of no part. And for so long, I mentioned Indigenous Australians in the political sphere. For so long, that has been the case there, for example. And I hope incrementally, at least, that is about to change. Not enough is said in the book about the position of women in particular. I do stress a lot gender parity in the kind of institutional context that I write about. And I do stress slightly differently from that point. Horses for courses. Democracy will and must be different in different places. And you mentioned East Africa. Well, in terms of West Africa, a book I was very influenced by and have been for some time is by Frederick Schaefer called Democracy in Translation, which is about Senegal and Senegalese democracy and how distinct and kind of contextual that is. I've gone on too long, but thank you, Danica. I will just say one more thing. I've talked about institutions in this talk today, just for kind of sake of clarity, I guess. But I actually define institutions in terms of practices. There's no such thing as an institution without practices, which are sustained by flesh and blood human beings and their interactions and processes. And I hope that's kind of a door open away from kind of too fixed, impersonal conceptions of institutions.
Okay, so we have 3 more questions, and we're aiming to conclude in about 10 minutes. And I think now really interesting questions are actually coming up, so it's going to be hard to finish this. The first question is from Sarah. Sarah put the question in the chat. Sarah, do you want me to read it out, or would you like to share it yourself?
Oh, I can pose it.
Fantastic.
Hello, congrats on the book. I'm very excited about reading it. I worked with Michael's theories since more than 12 years. So, and of course, when I started out with writing about political change in the Arab region prior to the uprisings, I read a lot of Robert Dahl, and I really disliked this kind of set of criteria because I simply didn't know how to work with it. And then I turned to Michael's theory on representative claims, which really inspired me to not use such fixed criteria, because often you have this problem that you assume that there is this fixed community that wants to establish or design a new democratic political system or a new political system. But then there are other powers involved, other communities that decide over others, with informal actors and many actors beyond the formal national government framework. So I was not surprised, and this is why I want to double check to hear about this 6 democratic requirements, because from my perspective and how I interpreted Michael's theories so far, they seem to kind of contradict the previous arguments. So my solution was more to empirically describe this kind of fluidity and hybrid forms of how decision making and political decisions are put into practice and are perceived over time, and how that creates a new form of political system and structure, so to say.
Okay, thanks a lot, Sarah. Lex, did you want to share your question yourself? If not, I can read it out. It says, what would be the design thinking resources you would most recommend to the group or to anyone who is interested in doing democratic design? So what is the resource for democratic design thinking resource? And then Susanna's question I was asked to read out because of she has a child around. So her question is, I was part of an interesting discussion earlier today, and Nadia Urbinati mentioned that the field of democratic innovation seemed to be creating a new technocratic elite made of scholars, designers, data analysts, etc. And we seem to be neutral and non-partisan, but is that in fact possible at all? Do you think there can be a horizontal democratic design? Could it ever be non-political? So with these 3 questions, Michael, we hand back over to you for a final sum up. And then maybe Becca and Azucena, if you want to add any final reflections, and then we'll conclude.
Thank you, Hans, and thanks for the questions. Thank you, Sarah. Nice to see you again. I hope you're doing okay. Sarah's got a book coming out on kind of representative claims in Egypt, which is quite innovative in that kind of area. And so I'm looking forward to that. I have asked myself, this again is a bit kind of navel gazing, I have asked myself, my writing on representation and my writing on democratic design, where do they meet? Do they meet? Where do they meet? I think, I don't think there's a contradiction. I think the material on the dynamics of representation, formal and informal, that I've worked on for some time is a kind of micro level performative kind of the creation of political structures, unstable ones, through practices and through action of elected and unelected and a whole variety of actors. So it's more at the kind of performative and micro level. The democratic design stuff is more about a very open-ended, I hope, flexible, I hope, approach to thinking about some of the structures that may, in part, constrain some of that activity. I don't think there's a contradiction in the sense that neither one is normative, except in the sense that good representation is a good thing generally, and democracy does mean something and will have value, even if people understand that value in different ways from different angles. They're both about agency or performance or practice within structures of some sort. So it's not kind of agency versus structure. So I don't think there's a contradiction, but I have wondered, and I must confess, maybe this goes back to kind of Becca's question in part about kind of how do you design a book on design? How do you frame the framework? It helps sometimes, I don't know what you folks think when you're writing books and articles, but it helps sometimes to have a fairly kind of narrow train track of thought, focusing on kind of one possibly stylized problem in order to kind of say something about it. And so I think of my democracy work, design work, and representation work being on different tracks, but they meet in all sorts of ways at interesting points. So I don't think there's a contradiction. Resources on design thinking. Okay, well, Becca, I'll say a couple I think are interesting, and then you can throw more in if you like. I think Nigel Cross's small book called Design Thinking is short and really good, a kind of good summary of some of this. The work of Lucy Kimball, who's at the University of Arts London and has a working relation with Becca, I know, is also very, very useful. And if you want to go back to sort of one of the influential earlier classics, you could go back to Herbert Simon in the 1950s. Someone's about to remind me the name of Simon's book. It's just kind of gone from it. Sciences of the Artificial there, I just remembered it. But Becca, do you want to throw anything else in there?
I'll just do a quick plug for the Social Design Institute at University of the Arts London, who've got a series of events, and those can be particularly rich. And it really depends on what level you're looking at your design thinking. Whether you're thinking about it as a tool to help you think about developing your theory, you might want to actually look at something as almost management-y style as IDEO's concept. There are courses on design thinking where it's very, very practical, but actually it can open up how you think about ideas. It's also quite problematic for the concept of democracy when you get into it, so that's fascinating. And Manzini's work on social innovation, when everyone designs, I've found interesting and somewhat instructive, but challenging as well.
Yes, and interestingly, and I think somebody pointed this out, it might have been you, Becca, a moment ago, that there are lots of books in political science with the word design or the phrase institutional design in the title or subtitle. They do not, I think it's fair to say, they do not ask what design means. They do not ask themselves what design means. But hey, interdisciplinary work, which we're all deeply encouraged by our universities to do all the time, let it be said, proper interdisciplinary work is really hard. It is really hard work. How do you kind of, it's like trying to learn a foreign language that you're deeply unfamiliar with. How do you even begin to enter into the kind of mental framework where you can understand how people in the other discipline talk, think, look at the world and so on. So it's quite tough. Am I part of an emerging technocratic, overpowerful elite? I don't feel like it. There could be a distinction here between two kind of levels of thinking about democracy and design. One is the, could be a democratic theorist, it could be someone else who comes along and says, that's my job, I do democratic designs, and here is my design. You asked for one, preferably you paid for one at a high consultancy rate, here is my design. That's kind of level one. Level two, where I hope I am, is to say something like, I'm not going to do it, you have to do it. I'll get involved if you think I could be useful. You have to do it, and here are some tools and guides that you can accept or reject, but I hope you find them useful, but that too is up to you. That is certainly my attitude, and I believe something like that is the attitude that ought to be adopted by anyone who has kind of slowly developing delusions of grandeur that, for example, the democratic theorists might have the answers.
Okay, thanks a lot, Michael. Alice and Becca, do you have any final reflections? Alice, maybe do you want to jump in, just whatever struck you, any thought to conclude this?
There are way too many thoughts, I think, to conclude in any possible way. I was just thinking right now of the fact that very often what seems to happen now is that university people are asked to organize democratic innovations, and how would that fit in this whole framework? But I won't speak any further. I want to thank Michael for answering our questions and for PDD for organizing this very much. It was a great event and a great book.
Thank you, Alice. Becca, do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share with us?
So firstly, actually looking at literature from the design thinking side on democracy, if you want to be fascinated as political theorists about what someone else thinks that you're up to, it's definitely an interesting read and some things to get into. I've really enjoyed this book, particularly as I thought that I was going to be doing quite a lonely journey along with Charlie Mealings on democratic theory and design, and now we have a framework. So I would like to thank Michael for, if nothing else, helping me get a literature review done in the next year. But also it's a really insightful book that it's that theory and practice divide that so often it's artificial, and it's a place that we can now start exploring and playing from. So I want to say thank you to Michael for the book. Thank you to Hans for giving me and Alice the time to prepare and to really play around with how we thought about the book as well, because it's a really interesting book and dense. And to be able to have that time to explore what we thought of it and how we were engaging with it was also a real privilege at this time. So thank you.
All right. I'd like to thank you all for participating. Before we conclude, I just have two small announcements. You probably all know the PSA conference is coming up 29th through 31st of March. The PDD section will consist of 8 panels, really exciting discussions coming up there. And we also have a roundtable on Mending Democracy, the new book. So there's going to be another book that's going to be debated. And then we have another book launch coming up on 10th of May, 3 p.m. It's going to be Stephen Coleman's How People Talk About Politics, Brexit and Beyond, which will be chaired by Anastasia and Danica. Okay, so with these announcements, we conclude the session. Thanks so much, Michael, Alice, and Becca. Thank you for the engaging conversations, and to all of you, obviously, for being here.
Thanks. Could I just say a quick word? I really appreciate you and Alice and Becca from kind of taking the time in difficult circumstances to kind of engage with the book, and for everybody else for their questions as well. Thank you very much.
It was our pleasure. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye. See you soon.